The letter in Jacob Vance's shirt pocket felt as thin and flimsy as his hopes. He had read it 100 times, the neat, careful script promising a woman named Sulin who was hardworking, modest, and of good character. He'd paid the agent in San Francisco nearly all he had, a desperate gamble for a partner to help him hold on to his small Nevada ranch. He expected someone plain, someone sturdy, someone whose hand showed a life of work. He did not expect the woman who now stood on the dusty street of Redemption Creek, having just descended from the afternoon stage. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. She wore a dress of dark green silk, the color of a deep forest pool, cut in a style so foreign and elegant it seemed to belong to another world entirely. It fit her form with a liquid grace, the high collar framing a face of impossible stillness. Her hair was a knot of polished black lacquer, held with a single pin of what looked like carved jade. She was not modest. She was not plain. She was a vision, and in the harsh glare of the Nevada sun, she was the most terrifying thing Jacob had ever seen. A slow, cold dread washed through him. That can't be my bride. He clutched the letter in his pocket, the paper crinkling in his fist. It was a mistake. A terrible, costly mistake. She scanned the crowd, her dark eyes unhurried, missing nothing. They passed over the gawking miners, the frozen shopkeepers, the women whispering behind their hands. Then her gaze landed on him, the only man standing alone, clutching a sweat-stained hat. For a single, heart-stopping moment, their eyes met. There was no fear in her expression, only a quiet, unnerving assessment. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a confirmation that shattered the last of his denial. This was Sulin. This was his intended. And as she took a single, deliberate step toward him, leaving the safety of the stagecoach behind, Jacob Vance knew his life, which had been a simple, hard struggle for survival, was about to become something else entirely. He had wanted a helper. He had gotten a spectacle. And in a town like Redemption Creek, a spectacle was a dangerous thing to be. The silence on Main Street finally broke, not with a word but with a low, ugly chuckle. Silas Croft, a man who owned half the town and had a standing offer on Jacob's ranch, pushed himself off the wall of the saloon. He was a big man, built of salted meat and cheap whiskey, and his smile never reached his eyes. "Well now, Vance," Croft drawled, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Looks like you ordered yourself something exotic from the catalog. What'd that cost you?" "A whole pig and a sack of beans." A few of his cronies laughed along with him. Jacob felt a hot flush of shame creep up his neck. His instinct was to fade away, to pretend this wasn't happening, the same way he dealt with most of Croft's provocations. But the woman, Sulin, was standing there, her back straight as a gun barrel, her expression unchanged. She was alone, 1,000 miles from wherever she came from, and he was the reason she was here. His gaze flickered from Croft's sneer to her calm face. Something inside him, a rusty piece of pride he thought long dead, grated into place. He took a step forward, putting himself between her and Croft. "She's with me," Jacob said. The words came out quiet, but they cut through the snickering. Croft's eyes narrowed. "With you? Don't have you figured for the type, Vance? Thought you liked your women broke and trained, like your horses." More laughter followed, louder this time. Jacob's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He could feel the eyes of the whole town on him. He could fight, but he'd lose. Croft was twice his size and half again as mean. Or he could run, and prove himself the coward Croft always claimed he was. But then he saw her hand, resting on the small traveling case she carried. Her knuckles were white. She was not as calm as she appeared. She was holding on, just like he was. "This is Miss Lynn," Jacob stated, his voice finding a firmer hold. "My fiancée." "You'll show her some respect." The word fiancé hung in the air, a lie so bold it felt like a physical object. Croft's amusement finally curdled. He looked from Jacob's determined face to Lynn's unreadable one. He had expected Jacob to crumble. When he did not, the game was no longer fun. "Fiancé, her." Croft spat a stream of tobacco juice near Jacob's boot. We'll see how long that lasts. He gave Lynn one last, lingering look, a look that was part threat and part appraisal, then turned and stomped back into the saloon. The show was over. The crowd began to disperse, talking in low murmurs. Jacob was left standing in the dust, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had won, for a moment. But he had also drawn a line, and he knew Silas Croft was not a man who let such things go. He finally turned to the woman. "Miss Lynn," he said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "I'm Jacob Vance. My wagon is over here." She simply nodded, her gaze sweeping over the dusty, hardscrabble town. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she said. Her voice was low and clear, with an accent that was precise and educated, not at all what he'd expected. It held no warmth, but it held no fear either. It held a purpose he could not yet fathom. The ride back to his ranch was a study in silence. The wagon creaked, the horses blew softly, and the vast, empty sky stretched over them, indifferent. Jacob drove, his shoulders tight, replaying the scene with Croft in his mind. He had never stood up to anyone like that, let alone for a stranger. A stranger he was now tied to by a public lie. Lynn sat beside him, her posture perfect, her hands folded in the lap of her incredible dress. She did not look at him. She looked out at the landscape, the sagebrush and the distant, heat-hazed mountains, with an intensity that made him feel like an intruder in his own life. What was she thinking? Was she terrified? Disgusted by his poverty, so evident in the worn harness and the patched wagon bed? He cleared his throat. "It's not much of a town," he offered, the word sounding lame and apologetic. "It'll do," she replied, without turning her head. Her brevity was more unnerving than any complaint. He tried again. "The ranch is another 5 miles. It's quiet." She finally turned to look at him, her eyes dark and serious. "Mr. Vance, the agent in San Francisco described you as an honest man. Is that true?" The question was so direct it took him aback. "I try to be, then let us be honest," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "The arrangement we have made is a practical one. You require a wife to satisfy the terms of your homestead claim. I require a new life, far from my old one. I will work. I will contribute. I will not be a burden. In return, I expect the protection of your name. Nothing more." He stared at the backs of his horses. This was not the timid, grateful woman he had read about in letters. This was a negotiation. "The protection of my name might not be worth much," he said, thinking of Croft. "Especially not after today." "It was enough today," she stated, as if it were a settled fact. "You acted with honor when it would have been easier not to. That has value." But Jacob felt a strange warmth spread through his chest, a feeling so unfamiliar he almost didn't recognize it. It was pride. He had spent the last 5 years breaking his back on this unforgiving land, and no one had ever said he'd done anything of value. The compliment, delivered so clinically, meant more than a whole book of praises. When they finally crested the last rise and his small, weathered cabin and corral came into view, nestled in a shallow valley, he braced himself for her reaction. It was a meager holding, a one-room clapboard house, a lean-to barn, and fences that were in constant need of mending. It screamed of struggle. Lynn surveyed the scene without a word. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. She took it all in, the house, the barn, the vast, lonely landscape. "There is water," she said. It was not a question. "A good spring," he confirmed, surprised. "Runs all year. It's why I settled here, and the land is yours. Filed the claim 3 years ago. Got to prove it up for 2 more. Build a life on it. That's the laws." He stopped the wagon by the cabin and jumped down. "That's why I sent for help." He felt foolish saying it now. She looked down at him from the wagon seat, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of something else in her eyes. Not pity, but a kind of weary understanding. "Then we had best get to work, Mr. Vance," she said, and allowed him to help her down. Her hand was small but firm in his. The silk of her dress felt impossibly soft against his calloused skin. It was the touch of two different worlds colliding in the dust. The next morning, Jacob awoke before dawn, his mind a tangle of anxieties. He'd given Lynn the bed, his only one, and had slept on a pallet by the cold hearth. The sight of her fine traveling cases next to his worn boots was a constant, jarring reminder of the absurdity of his situation. He stepped outside into the cool air, intending to start his chores, but stopped dead. A section of his north fence, the one bordering the roughest part of the open range, was down. Not just a post loose, but a good 20 yards of it, trampled and broken. His small herd of cattle, the product of 5 years of careful breeding and saving, was gone. A cold panic seized him. Without those cattle, he had nothing. He was ruined. He ran to the break, his boots kicking up dust. The tracks told the story. The herd had been deliberately spooked and driven out during the night. This was not an accident. This was Silas Croft's work, a direct response to yesterday's confrontation. As he stood there, staring at the empty pasture, the cabin door opened. Lynn emerged, not in her green silk dress, but in a simple, dark tunic and trousers, her hair tied back in a practical braid. She took in the scene at a glance, her eyes going from Jacob's despairing face to the broken fence. She walked over, her steps light and sure-footed. She knelt and examined the tracks, her fingers tracing the edges of a hoofprint in the dirt. They were pushed hard, she said. But not scattered. Driven north, toward the broken hills. Jacob just stared at her. They're gone. It'll take me a week to track them on my own, if I can find them at all. Croft's men will have them rebranded and sold by then. You are one man, she said, standing up and dusting off her hands. But you are not on your own. Before he could process her words, she walked to the lean-to barn. His horse, a steady buckskin named Boulder, nickered at her approach. Jacob had always prided himself on his way with animals, but he watched, dumbfounded, as she spoke to the horse in a low, calm tone, stroking its neck with a confidence that bespoke long practice. She moved with an economy of motion he'd only ever seen in seasoned ranch hands, saddling the horse with his spare tack, her knots swift and perfect. She checked the cinch, adjusted the stirrups, and led the horse out. There is another horse in the corral, she said, looking at him. A gray mare. Is she sound? She's green broke, he stammered. Barely. She will have to be, Lynn replied, swinging into Boulder's saddle with a fluid grace that made his jaw drop. She looked more at home on his horse than she had in the fancy stagecoach. The sun is rising, Mr. Vance. We are losing time. He stood frozen for a moment, the world tilting on its axis. The delicate princess from yesterday was gone. In her place was a woman of shocking, inexplicable competence. He did not know who she was or where she came from, but as she sat on his horse, waiting for him with an impatient patience, he knew one thing for certain. He was not going to lose his herd without a fight. And for the first time, he felt he might actually have a chance. They rode for hours, Lynn setting a relentless pace, her eyes scanning the ground. She read the trail like a book, pointing out turnstones and broken bits of brush that he would have missed in his panic. The woman who had negotiated her marriage contract like a business deal was now the most focused and capable tracker he had ever seen. The sun beat down on them, and the dust coated their throats, but she never complained. By midday, they found the herd. They were bunched in a narrow, box canyon, just as she predicted. 2 of Croft's men were lazily guarding the entrance, a small campfire smoking beside them. They clearly weren't expecting anyone to follow so quickly. We can't take them both, Jacob whispered, reining in his mare behind a rock outcropping. They're armed. Lynn slid from her horse, her movement silent. We will not fight them, she said. We will outthink them. She pointed to a high, narrow ridge that overlooked the canyon. Their horses are tired and thirsty. Our horses are fresh. You will create a distraction from the south. A rock slide. Anything to draw them away from the canyon mouth. When they ride out to investigate, I will move the herd. Move them how? He asked, incredulous. You're one person. The lead steer is an old brindle with a notched ear, she said, her eyes fixed on the cattle below. Cattle are animals of habit. They will follow a leader they trust. You get their attention. I will get his. Her plan was audacious, bordering on insane. But looking at the quiet confidence on her face, he found himself believing it could work. He nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. He circled wide to the south, dismounted, and began the arduous climb up the loose scree slope. When he was in position, he looked across the canyon and saw her, a small, dark figure moving like a shadow along the ridge. She gave a single, sharp wave. Taking a deep breath, Jacob put his shoulder into a large, precariously balanced boulder. It resisted, then gave way with a groan, tumbling down the slope and taking a cascade of smaller rocks and dust with it. The noise was like a thunderclap in the quiet canyon. Down below, Croft's men jolted to their feet, grabbing their rifles. As they spurred their tired horses toward the sound, Jacob watched as Lynn slipped down the other side of the canyon. She moved directly toward the herd, not with aggression, but with a calm, deliberate walk. The cattle shifted nervously, but she made no sudden moves. She murmured to them in that same low tone she'd used on his horse. He saw her approach the brindle steer. She reached out, not to touch it, but simply holding her hand out, patient. The old steer watched her, its head low. Then, miraculously, it took a step toward her, then another. She turned and began walking slowly out of the canyon, and the brindle followed. One by one, the rest of the herd fell in behind him, a silent, dusty river of hide and horn flowing out of the trap. By the time Croft's men realized they'd been tricked, Jacob was on his horse, and the entire herd was moving at a steady trot back toward home ground, with a woman he'd met less than 24 hours ago leading them as if she'd been born to it. That evening, the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee filled the small cabin. The herd was secure in the corral, the fence temporarily patched. A sense of weary triumph hung in the air. Lynn sat by the fire, her face illuminated by the flickering flames, cleaning and oiling Jacob's rifle with an expert's care. He watched her, the question that had been burning in him all day finally breaking free. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice quiet. No Miss Lynn from a San Francisco laundry knows how to track cattle or break down a firearm like that. She finished her task, sliding the bolt back into place with a satisfying click. She set the rifle aside and looked at him, her gaze direct. "My name is Lynn," she said. "That part is true. But my father was not a laundryman. He was a merchant. A very successful one. His name was Wagon, and he was one of the primary financiers for the Central Pacific Railroad's expansion through this territory." Jacob stared at her. He'd heard of Wagon. He was a legend among the Chinese laborers, a man who had risen from nothing to become a powerful figure in San Francisco, only to lose it all in a single bad deal. "I read he was ruined," Jacob said softly. "He was not ruined," Lynn's voice was cold steel. "He was cheated. By his American partner. A man who used my father's capital and connections to secure the most lucrative freighting contracts, then forged documents to cut him out, leaving him with all the debt and none of the profit. The man who destroyed him, who built his own fortune on my father's ruin, was Silas Croft." The name landed in the small cabin like a physical blow. Suddenly, everything made a terrifying kind of sense. Her arrival, her poise, her hidden skills. "My father died 6 months ago," she continued, her voice tight with a grief she refused to show. "He left me with nothing but his story," and this she reached into a small, lacquered box he hadn't noticed before and drew out a sheaf of papers tied with a ribbon. She handed them to him. It was a contract, written in both English and Chinese characters. It was old, the paper softened with handling. "This is the original partnership agreement. My father was a meticulous man. He knew Croft was a liar. See here?" She pointed to a clause on the last page. "This addendum grants my father's business, and therefore his heirs, a 50% stake in all water rights on any land acquired for the partnership's business. Croft needed the land, but my father provided the money to buy it. And this," she unfolded another, smaller piece of paper, "is a receipt from the Territorial Land Office, signed by the clerk at the time, acknowledging receipt of my father's payment for the initial survey. Croft's entire empire is built on land and water he only half owns." Jacob's hands trembled as he held the documents. This was not just a claim, it was a stick of dynamite. It was proof that could unravel everything Silas Croft had built. "Why come here like this?" he asked, his voice raspy. "Why the mail-order bride story?" "Because a woman alone, a Chinese woman, arriving in this town asking questions about Silas Croft would have disappeared within a day," she said, her expression grim. "But the mail-order bride of a quiet, unassuming homesteader? No one would look twice at her. I studied the homestead maps. I knew your claim was adjacent to Croft's main holdings. I knew you had a permanent water source, the one thing he desperately needs and cannot control. I chose you, Mr. Vance." It was not a random assignment. He looked from the papers to her face. The sheer, cold-blooded audacity of her plan was breathtaking. She had used him, used his desperation, to get her foot in the door. He should have been angry. He should have felt betrayed. Instead, a different feeling was taking root. It was a kind of awe. "So what now?" he asked. "You have the proof. What do you intend to do?" "I intend to take back what is mine," she said simply. "I will present this to the territorial marshal and file a legal claim. I will see Croft's assets frozen and his fraud exposed." "It's not that simple," Jacob warned, shaking his head. "Croft owns the sheriff. The judge is in his pocket. A piece of paper won't be enough. He'll bury you in court, or he'll bury you in the desert. He will not let you win. That is why I need you," she said, her gaze locking with his. "You are a landowner. A citizen. They will have to listen to you. I am a stranger. My word means nothing here. But your word, backing my claim, gives it weight. All I ask is that you stand with me. Help me file this claim. In return for the risk, I will sign over 10% of whatever I recover." He looked at the contract in his hands, then at the woman before him. She was offering him a fortune. But he knew the cost. Standing with her meant declaring open war on Silas Croft. It meant risking not just his ranch, but his life. He could tell her to leave. He could take her papers and burn them and go back to his quiet, hard life. It would be the safe thing to do, the smart thing. But as he looked at her, at the fierce, lonely courage in her eyes, he thought of her riding into that canyon. He thought of her facing down his fear with her own brand of steely resolve. He had sent for a partner to help him save his ranch. And she had arrived. Just not in the way he expected. He folded the papers carefully and handed them back to her. "Keep your 10%, he said. "We'll file the claim together." As partners, a flicker of surprise, of something soft and vulnerable, finally broke through her composure. It was there for only a second, but he saw it. And it was enough. The next few days passed in a tense quiet. They worked, strengthening the corral, tending the small garden, moving with a shared, unspoken purpose. But beneath the surface of their daily chores, a storm was gathering. They were waiting. On the third day, it broke. 2 riders appeared on the ridge overlooking the cabin. They weren't the same men from the canyon. These were harder men, their faces grim, their hands resting near their pistols. They rode down slowly, deliberately, not like visitors, but like men with a purpose. Jacob met them in the yard, his stance deceptively casual, his own pistol tucked into the back of his waistband. Lynn watched from the cabin doorway, a rifle held loosely in her hands. "Vance," the lead rider said, not bothering with a greeting. His name was Fletcher, Croft's right-hand man. "Mr. Croft heard you had some trouble with your fence. He's a good neighbor. He sent us to see if you needed help." The lie was so thin it was transparent. "Fence is mended," Jacob replied, his voice level. "We managed." Fletcher's gaze flickered to Lynn in the doorway, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "Heard you got yourself some company, too." "Fancy company of my fiancé," Jacob said, the word tasting less like a lie this time. "And this is my property. State your business or ride on." Fletcher's smile was a tight, ugly thing. He pulled a folded document from his coat. "This is our business. Mr. Croft has been reviewing his holdings. Turns out, there was a clerical error on the original survey of your claim. This here is a corrected deed, filed this morning. Your spring, the one you're so proud of, isn't on your land. It's on his. He's willing to be generous, though. He'll buy you out. $500. For the cabin and your trouble, $500 was an insult. The land, with the water, was worth 10 times that. It was a threat, wrapped in the thin paper of the law. My deed says otherwise, Jacob said, his hand moving subtly toward his back. Deeds can be corrected, Fletcher sneered. Especially when you have the right friends at the land office. You've got 24 hours to take the offer, Vance. After that, Mr. Croft will have to fence off his property. It'd be a shame for your cattle to go thirsty. He tossed the fraudulent deed into the dust at Jacob's feet. Think it over. The two men wheeled their horses around and rode off, leaving the threat hanging in the air. Jacob stared at the paper in the dirt. He had known Croft would retaliate, but this was faster, more brutal than he'd imagined. Croft wasn't just going to fight them in court, he was going to strangle their claim before it could even be filed. He was going to take the water, and without the water, the ranch would die. And so would they. He bent down and picked up the paper. It looked official. It looked legal. Against a man like Croft, their own contract felt as flimsy as the letter he still carried in his pocket. He turned and looked at Lynn. The fight had come to them. And their time had just run out. That night, the cabin felt smaller, the silence heavier. The fraudulent deed lay on the table between them, a declaration of war. His cut us off, Jacob said, pacing the short length of the room. The marshal is in Carson City, a 2-day ride. By the time we could get to him and back, Croft's fence will be up and his men will be guarding it. No one will cross him to take it down. Lynn was not pacing. She was studying the original contract, her father's contract, her brow furrowed in concentration. He is moving so quickly because he is afraid, she said. This document, she tapped the paper, it terrifies him. He knows what it means if it is seen by the right person. He is not trying to beat us. He is trying to erase us. He's doing a fine job of it, Jacob said bitterly. We have proof, but we have no power. It's a worthless piece of paper if we can't get it in front of someone who can't be bought. Lynn looked up, her eyes sharp. You said the receipt for the survey was signed by the clerk at the time. Do you know who that was? Jacob thought for a moment. A man named Peterson. Old man Peterson. He retired a few years back. Lives on a small claim south of here. He always hated Croft, said he was a bully and a cheat. But he's an old man. He wouldn't want troubles. An honest man who hates a cheat does not sit by and watch him win, Lynn stated. He is our power. He is the witness who can verify my father's payment. He can testify that the original survey, the one showing the spring on your land, was the true one. Croft's new deed is based on a lie, but Peterson's testimony can expose it. It was a long shot. Peterson was known for being a recluse, a man who wanted to be left alone. But it was the only shot they had. We ride at first light, Jacob decided. The next morning, they left before the sun was fully up, pushing their horses hard. They found Peterson's cabin tucked away in a grove of cottonwoods. He was a thin, stooped man with eyes that were still sharp and intelligent. He listened to their story without interruption, his gaze moving from Jacob's earnest face to Lynn's intense one. When they were finished, he looked at the contract and the receipt, his old, gnarled finger tracing his own signature from years ago. He was silent for a long time. Croft is a cancer on this territory, he finally said, his voice raspy with age. I knew he was cheating that Chinese fellow. I knew it then. But I was just a clerk. I had a family. I kept my head down. He looked at Lynn. Your father was a good man. A fair man. He deserved better. He stood up, his back straighter than before. It's long past time I did what was right. I'll ride with you to the land office. We'll file your claim. And I'll give my testimony. Let's see Silas Croft wriggle his way out of this. A wave of relief so profound it made Jacob feel lightheaded washed over him. For the first time, they had more than just a piece of paper. They had a voice. They had a chance. They rode into Redemption Creek not as victims, but as an army of three. Jacob, Lynn, and Old Man Peterson walked directly into the Territorial Land Office. The clerk, a young man clearly in Croft's pocket, paled when he saw them. "We're here to file a claim," Jacob announced, his voice ringing with a confidence he didn't know he possessed. He laid Lynn's contract on the counter. Before the clerk could protest, Peterson stepped forward. "And I'm here to give a sworn statement regarding the fraudulent survey of this man's homestead," Peterson said, his voice firm. "And the original investment made by Mr. Wagon in all of Silas Croft's holdings." Word spread through town like wildfire. People began to gather outside the land office, drawn by the scent of a showdown. Soon, the street was crowded. Then, the batwing doors of the saloon flew open and Silas Croft stormed out, his face purple with rage. "What is the meaning of this?" he boomed, stalking toward the office. "Peterson, you old fool, what are you doing?" "I'm setting a record straight, Silas," Peterson said, unintimidated. "A record you twisted 20 years ago." Croft saw the contract on the counter and his eyes went wide with fury and a flicker of fear. "That's a forgery." "Lies. This man," he pointed a thick finger at Jacob, "is a known troublemaker, and she," his gaze on Lynn was venomous, "is a foreign opportunist." "She is my partner," Jacob said, stepping forward. "And this is her father's contract. The one you signed. The one that makes her half owner of your entire operation." A gasp went through the crowd. The scale of the accusation was staggering. "It's a lie!" Croft roared. "This is my town." "The law is the law, Mr. Croft," a new voice cut in. Territorial Marshal Kane, a tall, weathered man who happened to be passing through on his circuit, stepped out of the crowd. He had heard the commotion from the hotel. "And these documents, along with Mr. Peterson's testimony, seem to warrant a very close look at your affairs. I'm placing a temporary freeze on all your assets and land titles pending a full investigation." Croft looked from the marshal's implacable face to the hostile eyes of the townspeople, people he had bullied and cheated for years, who now saw a chance for justice. He saw the contract on the counter, the symbol of a past he thought he had buried. He was trapped. His power, built on fear and lies, evaporated in the face of one simple, undeniable truth. His empire crumbled. He didn't say another word. He just turned, a broken man, and walked away, the crowd parting before him like the sea. In the quiet that followed, Jacob looked at Lynn. Her face was serene, but he saw the tremor in her hand as she rested it on the counter. It was over. She had done it. She had reclaimed her father's honor. 6 months later, the first snows of winter were dusting the high peaks. The ranch was transformed. A new, larger barn stood where the old lean-to had been. The fences were strong and straight, enclosing a herd that had doubled in size. The cabin now had a proper stone chimney and a new room added on, the wood still fragrant with the scent of fresh-cut pine. Jacob stood on the porch, watching the snow fall, a feeling of deep, quiet contentment settling over him. The territorial court had upheld Lynn's claim. Croft's assets were divided, and justice, slow but sure, had been done. Lynn's portion had been substantial, but instead of returning to the city, she had invested it here. In their land. In their future. The cabin door opened and she came out, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. She stood beside him, following his gaze. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "It is," he agreed. But he was not looking at the snow. He was looking at her. The sharp edges of her grief had softened, replaced by a calm strength that seemed to draw from the land itself. The partnership born of desperation and deceit had become something real, something forged in shared risk and mutual respect. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the old, tattered letter from the San Francisco agent, the one describing a hard-working, modest woman. He had kept it all this time. He held it out to her. "He wasn't entirely wrong," Jacob said, a slow smile spreading across his face. You are the most hard-working person I have ever known. She took the letter, her fingers brushing his. But I am not modest, Mr. Vance, she said, a rare, gentle smile touching her own lips. No, he said, his voice warm. You are not. And I am grateful for it every day. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and together they watched the snow blanket the valley. They had both come to this place seeking survival. He, a partner to work the land, and she, a foothold to reclaim a stolen legacy. But in the dust and danger of the Nevada frontier, they had found something more. They had found a home. And they had found it in each other. And that brings us to the end of this one. If you stayed with me all the way through, thank you. Stories like this one only get told because folks like you sit down and listen. If you liked what you heard, go ahead and hit that like button. And if you want more stories from the old frontier, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Until then, take care of yourself, and thanks again for being here.